There is a fifth dimension beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is the dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call the Twilight Zone.
Harper Audio presents The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street by Rod Serling, performed by Theodore Bikel. It was Saturday afternoon on Maple Street, and the late sun retained some of the warmth of a persistent Indian summer. People along the street marveled at winter's delay and took advantage of it. Lawns were being mowed, cars polished, kids played hopscotch on the sidewalks. Old Mr. Van Horn, the patriarch of the street, who lived alone, had moved his power saw out on his lawn and was fashioning new pickets for his fence. A good humor man bicycled in, around the corner, and was inundated by children and by shouts of, "Wait a minute!" from small boys hurrying to con nickels from their parents. It was 4:40 p.m. A football game blared from a portable radio on the front porch, blending with the other sounds of a Saturday afternoon in October. Maple Street, 4:40 p.m. Maple Street in its last calm and reflective moments before the monsters came. Steve Brand, 40-ish, a big man in an old ex-Marine set of dungarees, was washing his car when the lights flashed across the sky. Everyone on the street had felt the sound of the whoosh and the brilliant flash that dwarfed the sun. "What was that?" Steve called across at his neighbor, Don Martin, who was fixing a bent spoke on his son's bicycle. Martin, like everyone else, was cupping his hands over his eyes to stare up at the sky. He called back to Steve. "Looked like a meteor, didn't it? I didn't hear any crash, though, did you?" Steve shook his head. "Nope. Nothing except the roar." Steve's wife came out on the front porch. "Steve," she called, "what was that?" Steve shut off the water hose. "Guess it was a meteor, honey. Came awful close, didn't it?" "Much too close for my money," his wife answered. "Much too close." She went back into the house and became suddenly conscious of something. All along Maple Street, people paused and looked at one another as a gradual awareness took hold. All the sounds had stopped. All of them. There was a silence now. No portable radio, no lawnmowers, no clickety-click of sprinklers that went round and round on front lawns. There was a silence. Mrs. Sharp, 55 years of age, was talking on the telephone, giving a cake recipe to her cousin at the other end of town. Her cousin was asking Mrs. Sharp to repeat the number of eggs when her voice clicked off in the middle of the sentence. Mrs. Sharp, who was not the most patient of women, banged furiously on the telephone hook, screaming for an operator. Pete Van Horn was right in the middle of sawing a 1x4 piece of pine when the power saw went off. He checked the plug, the outlet on the side of the house, and then the fuse box in his basement. There was just no power coming in. Steve Brand's wife, Agnes, came back out on the porch to announce that the oven had stopped working. There was no current or something. Would Steve look at it? Steve couldn't look at it at that moment because he was preoccupied with a hose that suddenly refused to give any more water. Across the street, Charlie Farnsworth, fat and dumpy in a loud Hawaiian sports shirt that featured hula girls with pineapple baskets on their heads, barged angrily out toward the road, damning any radio outfit that manufactured a portable with a discourtesy to shut off in the middle of a third-quarter forward pass. Voices built on top of voices until suddenly there was no more silence. There was a conglomeration of questions and protests, of plaintive references to half-cooked dinners, half-watered lawns, half-washed cars, half-finished phone conversations. Did it have anything to do with a meteor? That was the main question, the one most asked. Pete Van Horn disgustedly threw aside the electric cord of his power mower and announced to the group of people who were collected around Steve Brand's station wagon that he was going on over to Bennett Avenue to check and see if the power had gone off there too. He disappeared into his backyard and was last seen heading into the backyard of the house behind his. Steve Brand, his face wrinkled with perplexity, leaned against his car door and looked around at the neighbors who had collected. "It just doesn't make sense," he said. "Why should the power go off all of a sudden and the phone line?" Don Martin wiped bicycle grease off his fingers. "Maybe some kind of electrical storm or something." Dumpy Charlie's voice was always unpleasantly high. "That just doesn't seem likely," he squealed. "Sky is just as blue as anything. Not a cloud, no lightning, no thunder, no nothing. How could it be a storm?" Mrs. Sharp's face was lined with years, but more deeply by the frustrations of early widowhood. "Well, it's a terrible thing when a phone company can't keep its line open," she complained. "Just a terrible thing." "What about my portable radio?" Charlie demanded. "Ohio State's got the ball on Southern Methodist's 18-yard line. They throw a pass, and the damn thing goes off just then." There was a murmur in the group as people looked at one another, and heads were shaken. Charlie picked his teeth with a dirty thumbnail. "Steve," he said in his high little voice, "why don't you go downtown and check with the police?" "They probably think we're crazy or something," Don Martin said. "A little power failure, and right away we get all flustered and everything." "It isn't just the power failure," Steve answered. "If it was, we'd still be able to get a broadcast on the portable." There was a murmur of reaction to this, and heads nodded. Steve opened the door to his station wagon. "I'll run downtown. We'll get all this straightened out." He inched his big frame onto the front seat behind the wheel, turned on the ignition, and pushed the starter button. There was no sound. The engine didn't even turn over. He tried it a couple of times more, and still there was no response. The others stared silently at him. He scratched his jaw. "Doesn't that beat all? It was working fine before." "Out of gas?" Don offered. Steve shook his head. "I just had it filled up." "What's it mean?" Mrs. Sharp asked. Charlie Farnsworth's piggish little eyes flapped open and shut. It's just as if everything had stopped. You better walk downtown, Steve." "I'll go with you," Don said. Steve got out of the car, shut the door, and turned to Don. "Couldn't be a meteor," he said. "A meteor couldn't do this." He looked off in thought for a moment, then nodded. "Come on, let's go." They started to walk away from the group when they heard the boy's voice. Tommy Bishop, aged 12, had stepped out in front of the others and was calling out to them. "Mr. Brand, Mr. Martin, you better not leave." Steve took a step back toward him. "Why not?" he asked. "They don't want you to," Tommy said. Steve and Don exchanged a look. "Who doesn't want us to?" Steve asked him. Tommy looked up toward the sky. "Them," he said. "Them?" Steve asked. "Who are them?" Charlie squealed. "Whoever was in that thing that came by overhead," Tommy said intently. Steve walked slowly back toward the boy and stopped close to him. "What, Tommy?" he asked. "Whoever was in that thing that came over," Tommy repeated. "I don't think they want us to leave here." Steve knelt down in front of the boy. "What do you mean, Tommy? What are you talking about?" "They don't want us to leave. That's why they shut everything off." "What makes you say that?" Irritation crept into Steve's voice. Whatever gave you that idea? Mrs. Sharp pushed her way through to the front of the crowd. That's the craziest thing I ever heard, she announced in a public address system voice. Just about the craziest thing I ever did hear. Tommy could feel the unwillingness to believe him. It's always that way, he said defensively. In every story I've ever read about a spaceship landing from outer space. Charlie Farnsworth whinnied out his derision. Mrs. Sharp waggled a bony finger in front of Tommy's mother. If you ask me, Sally Bishop, she said, you better get that boy of yours up to bed. He's been reading too many comic books or seeing too many movies or something. Sally Bishop's face reddened. She gripped Tommy's shoulders tightly. Tommy, she said softly, stop that kind of talk, honey. Steve's eyes never left the boy's face. That's all right, Tom. We'll be right back, you'll see. That wasn't a ship or anything like it. There was just a meteor or something, likely as not. He turned to the group, trying to weight his words with an optimism he didn't quite feel. No doubt it did have something to do with all this power failure and the rest of it. Meteors can do crazy things, like sunspots. That's right, Don said, as if picking up a cue. Like sunspots, that kind of thing. They can raise Cain with radio reception all over the world. And this thing being so close, why, there's no telling what sort of stuff it can do. He wet his lips nervously. Come on, Steve. We'll go into town and see if that isn't what's causing it all. Once again, the two men started away. Mr. Brand! Tommy's voice was defiant and frightened at the same time. He pulled away from his mother and ran after them. Please, Mr. Brand, please, don't leave here. There was a stir, a rustle, a movement among the people. There was something about the boy. Something about the intense little face. Something about the words that carried such emphasis, such belief, such fear. They listened to these words and rejected them because intellect and logic had no room for spaceships and green-headed things. But the irritation that showed in the eyes, the murmuring and the compressed lips had nothing to do with intellect. A little boy was bringing up fears that shouldn't be brought up. And the people on Maple Street this Saturday afternoon were no different from any other set of human beings. Order, reason, logic were slipping, pushed by the wild conjectures of a 12-year-old boy. Somebody ought to spank that kid, an angry voice muttered. Tommy Bishop's voice continued defiant. It pierced the murmurings and rose above them. You might not even be able to get to town, he said. It was that way in the story. Nobody could leave. Nobody except... Except who? Steve asked. Except the people they'd sent down ahead of them. They looked just like humans. It wasn't until the ship landed that... His mother grabbed him by the arm and pulled him back. Tommy, she said in a low voice, please, honey, don't talk that way. Damn right you shouldn't talk that way, came the voice of the man in the rear again. And we shouldn't stand here listening to him. Why, this is the craziest thing I've ever heard. The kid tells us a comic book plot, and here we stand listening. His voice died away as Steve stood up and faced the crowd. Fear can throw people into a panic, but it can also make them receptive to a leader. And Steve Brand, at this moment, was such a leader. The big man in the ex-Marine dungarees had an authority about him. Go ahead, Tommy, he said to the boy. What kind of story was this? What about the people that they sent out ahead? That was the way they prepared things for the landing, Mr. Brand, Tommy said. They sent 4 people, a mother and a father and 2 kids who looked just like humans. But they weren't. There was a murmur, a stir of uneasy laughter. People looked at one another again, and a couple of them smiled. Well, Steve said lightly but carefully, I guess we'd better run a check on the neighborhood to see which one of us are really human. His words were a release. Laughter broke out openly, but soon it died away. Only Charlie Farnsworth's hoarse whinny persisted over the growing silence, and then he too lapsed into a grim quietness, until all 15 people were looking at one another through changed eyes. A 12-year-old boy had planted a seed, and something was growing out of the street with invisible branches that began to wrap themselves around the men and women and pull them apart. Distrust lay heavy in the air. Suddenly, there was the sound of a car engine, and all heads turned as one. Across the street, Ned Rosen was sitting in his convertible trying to start it, and nothing was happening beyond the labored sound of a sick engine getting deeper and hoarser and finally giving up altogether. Ned Rosen, a thin, serious-faced man in his 30s, got out of his car and closed the door. He stood there staring at it for a moment, shook his head, looked across the street at his neighbors, and started toward them. "Can't get her started, Ned?" Don Martin called out to him. "No dice," Ned answered. "Funny. She was working fine this morning." Without warning, all by itself, the car started up and idled smoothly, smoke briefly coming out of the exhaust. Ned Rosen whirled around to stare at it, his eyes wide. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the engine sputtered and stopped. "Started all by itself," Charlie Farnsworth squealed excitedly. "How did it do that?" Mrs. Sharp asked. "How could it just start all by itself?" Sally Bishop let loose her son's arm and just stood there, shaking her head. "How in the world?" she began. Then there were no more questions. They stood silently staring at Ned Rosen, who looked from them to his car and then back again. He went to the car and looked at it. Then he scratched his head again. "Somebody explain it to me," he said. "I sure never saw anything like that happen before." He never did come out to look at that thing that flew overhead. He wasn't even interested, Don Martin said heavily. "What do you say we ask him some questions?" Charlie Farnsworth proposed importantly. "I'd like to know what's going on here." There was a chorus of assent, and 15 people started across the street toward Ned Rosen's driveway. Unity was restored. They had a purpose, a feeling of activity and direction. They were doing something. They weren't sure what, but Ned Rosen was flesh and blood, askable, reachable, and seeable. He watched with growing apprehension as his neighbors marched toward him. They stopped on the sidewalk close to the driveway and surveyed him. Ned Rosen pointed to his car. "I just don't understand it any more than you do. I tried to start it, and it wouldn't start. You saw me. All of you saw me." His neighbors seemed massed against him, solidly, alarmingly. "I don't understand it," he cried. "I swear, I don't understand. What's happening?" Charlie Farnsworth stood out in front of the others. "Maybe you better tell us," he demanded. "Nothing's working on this street, nothing. No lights, no power, no radio. Nothing except one car. Yours." There were mutterings from the crowd. Steve Brand stood back by himself and said nothing. He didn't like what was going on. Something was building up that threatened to grow beyond control. "Come on, Rosen," Charlie Farnsworth commanded shrilly. "Let's hear what goes on. Let's hear how you explain your car starting like that." Ned Rosen wasn't a coward. He was a quiet man who didn't like violence and had never been a physical fighter. But he didn't like being bullied. Ned Rosen got mad. "Hold it!" he shouted. "Just hold it. You keep your distance. All of you. All right. I've got a car that starts by itself. Well, that's a freak thing, I admit it. But does that make me some sort of a criminal or something? I don't know why the car works. It just does." The crowd was neither sobered nor reassured by Rosen's words, but they were not too frightened to listen. They huddled together, mumbling, and Ned Rosen's eyes went from face to face till they stopped on Steve Brand's. Ned knew Steve Brand. Of all the men on the street, this seemed the guy with the most substance, the most intelligent, the most essentially decent. "What's it all about, Steve?" he asked. We're all on a monster kick, Ned, he answered quietly. Seems that the general impression holds that maybe one family isn't what we think they are. Monsters from outer space or something. Different from us. Fifth columnists from the vast beyond. He couldn't keep the sarcasm out of his voice. You know anybody around here who might fit that description? Rosen's eyes narrowed. What is this, a gag? He looked around the group again. This a practical joke or something? And without apparent reason, without logic, without explanation, his car started again, idled for a moment, sending smoke out of the exhaust, and stopped. A woman began to cry, and the bank of eyes facing Ned Rosen looked cold and accusing. He walked to his porch steps and stood on them, facing his neighbors. Is that supposed to incriminate me? He asked. The car engine goes on and off, and that really does it, huh? He looked down into their faces. I don't understand it, not any more than you do. He could tell that they were unmoved. This couldn't really be happening, Ned thought to himself. Look, he said in a different tone, you all know me. We've lived here 4 years, right in this house. We're no different from any of the rest of you. He held out his hands toward them. The people he was looking at hardly resembled the people he'd lived alongside of for the past 4 years. They looked as if someone had taken a brush and altered every character with a few strokes. Really, he continued, this whole thing is just weird. Well, if that's the case, Ned Rosen, Mrs. Sharp's voice suddenly erupted from the crowd, maybe you'd better explain why. She stopped abruptly and clamped her mouth shut, but looked wise and pleased with herself. Explain what? Rosen asked her softly. Steve Brand sensed a special danger now. Look, he said, let's forget this right now. Charlie Farnsworth cut him off. Go ahead. Let her talk. What about it? Explain what? Mrs. Sharp, with an air of great reluctance, said, well, sometimes I go to bed late at night. Couple of times I've come out on the porch and I've seen Ned Rosen here, in the wee hours of the morning, standing out in front of his house, looking up at the sky. She looked around the circle of faces. That's right, looking up at the sky as if he was waiting for something. She paused for emphasis, for dramatic effect. As if he was looking for something, she repeated. The nail in the coffin, Steve Brand thought. One dumb, ordinary, simple idiosyncrasy of a human being, and that probably was all it would take. He heard the murmuring of the crowd rise and saw Ned Rosen's face turn white. Rosen's wife, Anne, came out on the porch. She took a look at the crowd and then at her husband's face. What's going on, Ned? She asked. I don't know what's going on, Ned answered. I just don't know, Anne. But I'll tell you this. I don't like these people. I don't like what they're doing. I don't like them standing in my yard like this, and if any one of them takes another step and gets close to my porch, I'll break his jaw. I swear to God, that's just what I'll do. I'll break his jaw. Now go on. Get out of here, all of you. He shouted at them. Get the hell out of here. Ned. Anne's voice was shocked. You heard me? Ned repeated. All of you, get out of here. None of them eager to start an action, the people began to back away. But they had an obscure sense of gratification. At least there was an opponent now, someone who wasn't one of them. And this gave them a kind of secure feeling. The enemy was no longer formless and vague. The enemy had a front porch and a front yard and a car. And he had shouted threats at them. They started slowly back across the street, forgetting for the moment what had started it all. Forgetting that there was no power and no telephones. Forgetting even that there had been a meteor overhead not 20 minutes earlier. It wasn't until much later, as a matter of fact, that anyone posed a certain question. Old man Van Horn had walked through his backyard over to Bennett Avenue. He'd never come back. Where was he? It was not one of the questions that passed through the minds of any of the 30 or 40 people on Maple Street who sat on their front porches and watched the night come and felt the now menacing darkness close in on them. There were lanterns lit all along Maple Street by 10 o'clock. Candles shone through living room windows and cast flickering, unsteady shadows all along the street. Groups of people huddled on front lawns around their lanterns, and a soft murmur of voices was carried over the Indian summer night air. All eyes eventually were drawn to Ned Rosen's front porch. He sat there, on the railing, observing the little points of light spotted around in the darkness. He knew he was surrounded. He was the animal at bay. His wife came out on the porch and brought him a glass of lemonade. Her face was white and strained. Like her husband, Ann Rosen was a gentle person, unarmored by temper or any proclivity for outrage. She stood close to her husband now on the darkened porch, feeling the suspicion that flowed from the people around the lanterns, thinking to herself that these were the people she had entertained in her house. These were women she talked to over clotheslines in the backyard, people who had been friends and neighbors only that morning. Oh, dear God! Could all this have happened in those few hours? It must be a nightmare, she thought. It had to be a nightmare that she could wake up from. It couldn't be anything else. Across the street, Mabel Farnsworth, Charlie's wife, shook her head and clucked at her husband, who was drinking a can of beer. "It just doesn't seem right, though, Charlie, keeping watch on them. Why, he was right when he said he was one of our neighbors. I've known Ann Rosen ever since they moved in. We've been good friends." Charlie Farnsworth turned to her disgustedly. "That don't prove a thing," he said. "Any guy who'd spend his time looking up at the sky early in the morning, well, there's something wrong with that kind of person. There's something that ain't legitimate. Maybe under normal circumstances we could let it go by. But these aren't normal circumstances." He turned and pointed toward the street. "Look at that," he said. "Nothing but candles and lanterns. Why, it's like going back into the Dark Ages or something." He was right. Maple Street had changed with the night. The flickering lights had done something to its character. It looked odd and menacing and very different. Up and down the street, people noticed it. The change in Maple Street. It was the feeling one got after being away from home for many, many years and then returning. There was a vague familiarity about it, but it wasn't the same. It was different. Ned Rosen and his wife heard footsteps coming toward their house. Ned got up from the railing and shouted out into the darkness. "Whoever it is, just stay right where you are. I don't want any trouble, but if anybody sets foot on my porch, that's what they're going to get. Trouble." He saw that it was Steve Brand, and his features relaxed. "Ned," Steve began. Ned Rosen cut him off. "I've already explained to you people. I don't sleep very well at night sometimes. I get up and I take a walk and I look up at the sky. I look at the stars." Ann Rosen's voice shook as she stood alongside of him. "That's exactly what he does. Why, this whole thing, it's some kind of madness or something." Steve Brand stood on the sidewalk and nodded grimly. "That's exactly what it is. Some kind of madness." Charlie Farnsworth's voice from the opposite yard was spiteful. "You'd best watch who you're seen with, Steve. Until we get this all straightened out, you ain't exactly above suspicion yourself." Steve whirled around to the outline of the fat figure that stood behind the lantern in the other yard. "Or you either, Charlie," he shouted. "Or any of the rest of us." Mrs. Sharp's voice came from the darkness across the street. "What I'd like to know is, what are we going to do? Just stand around here all night?" "There's nothing else we can do," Charlie Farnsworth said. He looked wisely over toward Ned Rosen's house. "One of them will tip their hand. They've got to." It was Charlie's voice that did it for Steve Brand at this moment. The shrieking pig squeal that came from the layers of fat and the idiotic sports shirt and the dull, dumb, blind prejudice of the man. "There's something you can do, Charlie," Steve called out to him. "You can go inside your house and keep your mouth shut." "You sound real anxious to have that happen, Steve," Charlie's voice answered him back from the little spot of light in the yard across the street. "I think we better keep our eye on you, too." Don Martin came up to Steve Brand carrying a lantern. There was something hesitant in his manner, as if he were about to take a bit in his teeth, but wondered whether it would hurt. "I think everything might as well come out now," Don said. "I really do. I think everything should come out." People came off porches from front yards to stand around in a group near Don, who now directly turned towards Steve. "Your wife's done plenty of talking, Steve, about how odd you are," he said. Charlie Farnsworth trotted over. "Go ahead. Tell us what she said," he demanded excitedly. Steve Brand knew this was the way it would happen. He was not really surprised, but he still felt a hot anger rise up inside of him. "Go ahead," he said. "What's my wife said? Let's get it all out." He peered around at the shadowy figures of the neighbors. "Let's pick out every goddamn peculiarity of every single man, woman, and child on this street. Don't stop with me and Ned. How about a firing squad at dawn, so we can get rid of all the suspects? Make it easier for you." Don Martin's voice retreated fretfully. "There's no need getting so upset, Steve." "Go to hell, Don," Steve said to him in a cold and dispassionate fury. Needled, Don went on the offensive again, but his tone held something plaintive and petulant. "Just so happens that, well, Agnes has talked about how there's plenty of nights you've spent hours in your basement working on some kind of radio or something. Well, none of us have ever seen that radio." "Go ahead, Steve," Charlie Farnsworth yelled at him. "What kind of radio set you working on? I've never seen it. Neither has anyone else. Who do you talk to on that radio set, and who talks to you?" Steve's eyes slowly traveled in an arc over the hidden faces and the shrouded forms of neighbors who were now accusers. "I'm surprised at you, Charlie," he said quietly. "I really am. How come you're so goddamn dense all of a sudden? Who do I talk to? I talk to monsters from outer space. I talk to three-headed green men who fly over here in what look like meteors." Agnes Brand walked across the street to stand at her husband's elbow. She pulled at his arm with frightened intensity. Steve, please," she said. "It's just the ham radio set," she tried to explain. "That's all. I bought him a book on it myself. It's just a ham radio set. A lot of people have them. I can show it to you. It's right down in the basement." Steve pulled her hand off his arm. "You show them nothing," he said to her. "If they want to look inside our house, let them get a search warrant." Charlie's voice whined at him. "Look, buddy, you can't afford to—" "Charlie," Steve shouted at him, "don't tell me what I can afford. And stop telling me who's dangerous and who isn't, and who's safe and who's a menace." He walked over to the edge of the road and saw that people backed away from him. "And you're with him, all of you," Steve bellowed at them. "You're standing there all set to crucify, to find a scapegoat, desperate to point some kind of a finger at a neighbor." There was intensity in his tone and on his face, accentuated by the flickering light of the lanterns and the candles. "Well, look, friends, the only thing that's going to happen is that we'll eat each other up alive. Understand? We're going to eat each other up alive." Charlie Farnsworth suddenly ran over to him and grabbed his arm. "That's not the only thing that can happen to us," he said in a frightened, hushed voice. "Look." "Oh, my God," Don Martin said. Mrs. Sharp screamed. All eyes turned to look down the street, where a figure had suddenly materialized in the darkness, and the sound of measured footsteps on concrete grew louder and louder as it walked toward them. Sally Bishop let out a stifled cry and grabbed Tommy's shoulder. The child's voice screamed out, "It's the monster! It's the monster!" There was a frightened wail from another woman, and the residents of Maple Street stood transfixed with terror as something unknown came slowly down the street. Don Martin disappeared, came back out of his house a moment later carrying a shotgun. He pointed it toward the approaching form. Steve pulled it out of his hands. "For God's sake, will somebody think a thought around here? Will you people wise up? What good would a shotgun do against..." A quaking, frightened Charlie Farnsworth grabbed the gun from Steve's hand. "No more talk, Steve," he said. "You're going to talk us into a grave. You'd let whoever's out there walk right over us, wouldn't you? Well, some of us won't." He swung the gun up and pulled the trigger. The noise was a shocking, shattering intrusion, and it echoed and re-echoed through the night. 100 yards away, the figure collapsed like a piece of clothing blown off a line by the wind. From front porches and lawns, people raced toward it. Steve was the first to reach him. He knelt down, turned him over, and looked at his face. Then he looked up toward the semicircle of silent faces surveying him. "All right, friends," he said quietly. "It happened. We got our first victim, Pete Van Horn." "Oh, my God," Don Martin said in a hushed voice. "He was just going over to the next block to see if the power was on." Mrs. Sharp's voice was that of injured justice. "You killed him, Charlie. You shot him dead." Charlie Farnsworth's face looked like a piece of uncooked dough, quivering and shaking in the light of the lantern he held. "I didn't know who he was," he said. "I certainly didn't know who he was." Tears rolled down his fat cheeks. "He comes walking out of the dark. How am I supposed to know who he was?" He looked wildly around and then grabbed Steve's arm. Steve could explain things to people. "Steve!" he screamed. "You know why I shot. How was I supposed to know he wasn't a monster or something?" Steve looked at him and didn't say anything. Charlie grabbed Don. We're all scared of the same thing," he blubbered. "The very same thing. I was just trying to protect my home, that's all. Look, all of you, that's all I was trying to do." He tried to shut out the sight of Pete Van Horn, who stared up at him with dead eyes and a shattered chest. "Please, please, please," Charlie Farnsworth sobbed. "I didn't know it was somebody we knew. I swear to God I didn't know." The lights went on in Charlie Farnsworth's house and shone brightly on the people of Maple Street. They looked suddenly naked. They blinked foolishly at the lights, and their mouths gaped like fishes. "Charlie," Mrs. Sharp said like a judge pronouncing sentence, "how come you're the only one with lights on now?" Ned Rosen nodded in agreement. "That's what I'd like to know," he said. Something inside tried to check him, but his anger made him go on. "How come, Charlie? You're quiet all of a sudden. You've got nothing to say out of that big fat mouth of yours. Well, let's hear it, Charlie. Let's hear why you've got lights." Again, the chorus of voices punctuated the request and gave it legitimacy and a vote of support. "Why, Charlie?" the voices asked him. "How come you're the only one with lights?" The questions came out of the night to land against his fat, wet cheeks. "You were quick to kill," Ned Rosen continued. "And you were so quick to tell us who we had to be careful of. Well, maybe you had to kill Charlie. Maybe Pete Van Horn, God rest his soul, was trying to tell us something. Maybe he'd found out something and had come back to tell us who there was among us we should watch out for." Charlie's eyes were little pits of growing fear as he backed away from the people and found himself up against a bush in front of his house. "No," he said. "No, please." His chubby hands tried to speak for him. They waved around, pleading, the palms outstretched, begging for forgiveness and understanding. "Please, please, I swear to you, it isn't me. It really isn't me." A stone hit him on the side of the face and drew blood. He screamed and clutched at his face as the people began to converge on him. "No!" he screamed. "No!" Like a hippopotamus in a circus, he scrambled over the bush, tearing his clothes and scratching his face and arms. His wife tried to run toward him, but somebody stuck a foot out and she tripped, sprawling headfirst on the sidewalk. Another stone whistled through the air and hit Charlie on the back of the head as he raced across his front yard toward his porch. A rock smashed at the porch light and sent glass cascading down on his head. "It isn't me!" he screamed back at them as they came toward him across the front lawn. "It isn't me, but I know who it is," he said suddenly without thought. Even as he said it, he realized it was the only possible thing to say. People stopped, motionless as statues, and a voice called out from the darkness. "All right, Charlie. Who is it?" He was a grotesque fat figure of a man who smiled now through the tears and the blood that cascaded down his face. "Well, I'm going to tell you," he said. "I'm now going to tell you, because I know who it is. I really know who it is. It's—" "Go ahead, Charlie," a voice commanded him. "Who's the monster?" Don Martin pushed his way to the front of the crowd. "All right, Charlie. Now, let's hear it." Charlie tried to think. He tried to come up with a name. A nightmare engulfed him. Fear whipped at the back of his brain. "It's the kid!" he screamed. "That's who it is! It's the kid!" Sally Bishop screamed and grabbed at Tommy, burying his face against her. "That's crazy," she said to the people who now stared at her. "That's crazy. He's a little boy." "But he knew," said Mrs. Sharp. "He was the only one who knew. He told us all about it." "Well, how did he know? How could he have known?" Voices supported her. "How could he know? Who told him? Make the kid answer." A fever had taken hold now. A hot, burning virus that twisted faces and forced out words and solidified the terror inside of each person on Maple Street. Tommy broke away from his mother and started to run. A man dove at him in a flying tackle and missed. Another man threw a stone wildly toward the darkness. They began to run after him down the street. Voices shouted through the night. Women screamed. A small child's voice protested, a playmate of Tommy's. One tiny voice of sanity in the middle of a madness as men and women ran down the street, the sidewalks, the curbs, looking blindly for a 12-year-old boy. And then suddenly the lights went on in another house. A 2-story gray stucco house that belonged to Bob Weaver. A man screamed, "It isn't the kid! It's Bob Weaver's house!" A porch light went on at Mrs. Sharp's house, and Sally Bishop screamed, "It isn't Bob Weaver's house! It's Mrs. Sharp's place!" "I tell you, it's the kid!" Charlie screamed. The lights went on and off down the street. A power mower suddenly began to move all by itself, lurching crazily across a front yard, cutting an irregular patch of grass until it smashed against the side of the house. "It's Charlie!" Don Martin screamed. "He's the one!" And then he saw his own lights go on and off. They ran this way and that way, over to one house and then back across the street to another. A rock flew through the air and then another. A pane of glass smashed, and there was the cry of a woman in pain. Lights on and off, on and off. Charlie Farnsworth went down on his knees as a piece of brick plowed a 2-inch hole in the back of his skull. Mrs. Sharp lay on her back screaming and felt the tearing jab of a woman's high heel in her mouth as someone stepped on her, racing across the street. From a quarter of a mile away, on a hilltop, Maple Street looked like this, a long, tree-lined avenue full of lights going on and off, and screaming people racing back and forth. Maple Street was a bedlam. It was an outdoor asylum for the insane. Windows were broken, streetlights and clusters of broken glass down on the heads of women and children. Power mowers started up, and car engines and radios. Blaring music mixed with the screams and shouts and the anger. Up on top of the hill, two men, screened by the darkness, stood near the entrance to a spaceship and looked down on Maple Street. The first figure said, "Understand the procedure now? Just stop a few of their machines and radios and telephones and lawn mowers. Throw them into darkness for a few hours and then watch the pattern unfold." "And this pattern is always the same?" the second figure asked. The answer came, "With few variations. They pick the most dangerous enemy they can find, and it's themselves. All we need to do is sit back and watch." "Then I take it this place, this Maple Street, is not unique." Figure 1 shook his head and laughed. "By no means. Their world is full of Maple Streets, and we'll go from one to the other and let them destroy themselves." He started up the incline toward the entrance of the spaceship. "One to the other," he said, as the other figure followed him. "One to the other." There was just the echo of his voice as the two figures disappeared and a panel slid softly across the entrance. "One to the other," the echo said. When the sun came up on the following morning, Maple Street was silent. Most of the houses had been burned. There were a few bodies lying on sidewalks and draped over porch railings. But the silence was total. There simply was no more life. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, there was no more world, or at least not the kind of world that had greeted the morning. And by Wednesday afternoon of the following week, a new set of residents had moved into Maple Street. They were a handsome race of people. Their faces showed great character indeed. Great character and excellently shaped heads. Excellently shaped heads. 2 to each new resident.
The tools of conquest do not necessarily come with bombs and explosions and fallout. There are weapons that are simply thoughts, attitudes, prejudices, to be found only in the minds of men. For the record, prejudices can kill, and suspicion can destroy, and a thoughtless, frightened search for a scapegoat has a fallout all of its own for the children, and the children yet unborn. And the pity of it is that these things cannot be confined to the Twilight Zone.